Hello again and welcome to In Taiwan We Speak. I am Alexander Shin and today we continue our conversation about the Siraya language with Jolan Hsieh or Babarik Dagalomai, a Siraya Indigenous rights advocate and a professor at the Department of Ethnic Relations and Cultures at the National Donghua University in Hualien. So, Professor Hsieh, let's talk about Taiwan's democratization that started in the 1980s. One of its components was, of course, the cultural revitalization movements led by various ethnic and linguistic groups here. And one of the milestones of it was that in 1994, the term that was used within the constitution for the indigenous people was rectified. So the old term was Shanbao, which literally means mountain compatriots in English, if I'm not wrong. And it's been almost 30 years since this rectification of the term in the constitution, yet Plains indigenous peoples are still struggling to gain official recognition by the Taiwanese government. Why, in your opinion, has it been so difficult for Plains indigenous groups to defend their indigeneity?
If we all said that also Pingpu or Plain indigenous is a part of indigenous people, even the current official recognized indigenous people feel, yes, Pingpu are indigenous, but they're being assimilated too long and they're always being interracial marriage with non-indigenous peoples, and they are the earliest to being in contact with the foreign force and the colonizers. So that is why they are less indigenous. So that creates false dichotomies, because for mountain indigenous or the current recognized plain indigenous, they also been forced to interracial marriage and being assimilated, and they lost their language to the same degree as we do. So that is pretty much the same thing. So get back to your question about why Pingpu people struggle to get recognition. One of the key points is if we claim that plain indigenous Pingpu people are part of the current indigenous status being recognized, current plain indigenous people worry about to fight for the resources in terms of a legislator's seat, political power. Because under our constitution, there are 6 guaranteed seats for legislators. 3 seats for mountain indigenous, 3 seats for plain indigenous. However, for Pingpu, plain indigenous peoples, our status were being pushed out like in 1956 or 57. So even when Japanese time was still being recognized as indigenous peoples. And Chinese Nationalist Party came over in one of the election. So they call to say, hey, do we want to put Pingpu, indigenous people, as in normal district, general district, or for indigenous election district? And then they say, oh, that is by their choice, and if they register, then they can, do like for the indigenous district. Many of our people don't know Mandarin Chinese, and then the paperwork or document never go to our area. So people don't know you have to register. And then they lost their indigenous identities. And later on, government and official recognized people say, hey, you guys give up your indigenous status by yourself. So that creates the inner struggle. A group of people claim like we lost our identity because we choose to do that. But then the other people, a group of people saying, hey, no, because in Taiwan, all the indigenous people is manipulated by the government at the time. They want to get rid of indigenous peoples. They want everybody to become Mandarin Chinese or mainlanders or Japanese time. They also want to convert all the indigenous people. If you get educated, then you convert them to have a Japanese name and to become Japanese citizen. So anyhow, that is part of the history that being internal struggle and external struggle. And another fact was that in Taiwan, our indigenous population is very small. So official recognized indigenous people is only a little bit more than 2.5% right now, right? So we facing discrimination even now, even though we all push for the multiculturalism and then celebrate the indigenous identities. So back to 10, 20 years ago, that is even worse. People make fun of indigenous peoples. They don't really want to hire indigenous peoples. A lot of prejudice against the indigenous peoples, saying we're lazy, we only know how to sing, and then sports, and then no brain, and all those kind of a negative thing. So it doesn't matter it's a Pingpu people or non-Pingpu people, or it just generally if you're indigenous people. You have to face that period of time to celebrate your identity is almost impossible. Everybody wants to hide their identity. So that was kind of a social background. You have to understand that we all victims together. And then the other thing is that for officially recognized indigenous populations, some of them, they have no choice because the government collected that they don't allow you to have a freedom of a choice whether or not you want to claim yourself as indigenous. So you're also being forced to choose the indigenous category. So what I'm saying this is the whole colonial policies to identify who you are. But we begin to aware who we are and as indigenous, and also we've been raised the consciousness about how our culture is so precious and it's very unique in Taiwan. And to know who you are is very important. So we want to celebrate that part of our identity within us and then in our soul and in our blood. The struggle is we do not have enough of communication channel to understand each other's facing the same collective struggle and then the memory with official recognized people, because we've been always been divided and separated, and even the mountain and plain indigenous people is a false dichotomy. So they shouldn't be put that two different categories, totally wrong. Your radio station and the program is very important because that it's make people, even though I know it's very complicated.
Indeed.
Yeah, but it's way for people to know, wow, that is a big issue here. And the conflict or the internal or external struggle, it's very unique. At the same time, it's very powerful because through this fight and then struggle make us more strong and then to stick together. And so in the last 20, 30 years, I've been doing this indigenous right advocating my own people, and most of the government official recognize the indigenous people. They know my heart, and then they know my work. It's for the plain indigenous peoples, not just for Siraya people only. And then I think that is very important because in Taiwan we've been separated and being categorized, and then they try to make you all different. We have a different culture, but we all the same humankind.
It's especially meaningful because you are coming from a diverse background with both Siraya and Amis Pangsa roots.
Right.
So you're saying that the very notion that there is mountains indigenous peoples and plains indigenous peoples is perpetuated as a part of the colonial tool to sort of divide and differentiate.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and so that is the way how they better control indigenous populations.
Right.
And then we all saying ourselves, refer ourselves as our nation's name. So we have a Siraya, we have a Makata, we have Tavulong. And that's the same thing for mountain indigenous or for plain indigenous and the Amis and Bangsa and Taiwan and Rukai. So all different indigenous nations, we all want to refer ourselves as our indigenous nation. So again, back to that the policy, the government policy to differentiate this category just for better controlling, better management. And that is following by the Japanese rule. And then Japanese was following by the anthropologists and by linguistic. They did that wrong.
Do you think that these dichotomies are obsolete and we're just moving towards a recognition of specific indigenous groups without any attachment to mountains or plains
Yeah.
or people.
Yes. Most of the people understand that is wrong, but because of constitution, it's so hard to amend constitution because current two main party, KMT and DPP, they don't really agree with the one common goal. So if DPP proposed to do this amendment and KMT will say no, and if KMT proposed to do this and then the DPP will say no, so none of them really want to join together and to see, hey, this category totally make no sense, and then we want to amend that. So, that will be major problem and major challenge to do that.
Once a group is recognized, what are the benefits of that?
Let me talk a little bit about one of the group that is a good example. Gavalan is one of historically belong to Pingpu people. So they are pretty much in Yilan County, and then they migrate to Hualien. So they were being categorized as Amis people. But they also fight very hard and then become the 11th group in Taiwan as indigenous people. After they being recognized as Gavalan peoples, they be able to get government funding to preserve the cultures. For example, banana fabric, it's their very unique art, clothing and then accessory and all those, very unique technique to do banana fabric and then to turn into fabric or artwork. So they be able to have funding to have elder to preserve that and then to teach to younger generation. Another thing is because they're officially recognized as indigenous group, so they be able to do language revitalizations. So we have an Indigenous Language Act. We have the foundation to do cultural language preservation and then to teach indigenous language. So you got that funding to do that. So people might ask, so you can self-identify yourself indigenous. You don't need to have a government to identify you. I totally agree with that. Yet, a lot of wrongdoing because of the colonization process and then the result. We needed to demanding all those funding and resources to make things right. So you cannot say, hey, I did this wrong to you and then apologize for that and that's it. And with the current culture, all in Mandarin Chinese, and we grew up with, if we speak our own language or non-Mandarin Chinese, we got punishment. If we don't have this recognition, we don't have the right to claim that the government needed to do something to compensate what they did wrong. Cultural revitalization, one thing. Language revitalization, one thing. And then, so that is two very important things you definitely need to preserve as indigenous peoples, right? So you have a long history being assimilated into different colonizers' culture, Japanese and Chinese and all different things. And right now, we want to celebrate our identities. We still have our cultures, beautiful arts, and languages. When we say, hey, we celebrate the cultural diversity and then we recognize indigenous rights, at the same time, you need to provide resources and funding to revitalize them.
So it's a matter of justice.
Yes. You need to turn the wrong thing right. And funding resources are very important. Most people still live in a very minimum resources. And then they're still struggling for the daily needs. So you want them to learn indigenous language and then say, hey, that is your responsibilities. Hello, get real, right? You need to provide the resources for them to be able to do that.
That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Professor Jolan Hsieh, for your sharing, and everyone else, thank you for tuning in. Once again, we will be waiting for you next week with more. My name is Oleg, and this was In Taiwan We Speak, your audio guide to Taiwan's mind-blowing linguistic diversity. See you next week.